Ian Bremmer, the title of your recent book is The Power of Crisis. So, are we to believe that you think crises are actually a good thing?
I mean, I think we'd rather not have them than have them. But I think we all know that over the past couple of decades, we've watched our society get increasingly anxious as our institutions have eroded, as our trust has eroded for our leaders, and people feeling like there's just no way out, that it's just not going to get better. Well, the fact is, we are seeing that the crises that we are facing today, whether we're talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine, or we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about the pandemic, have actually led to some fairly dramatic and way overdue responses that we all really do need to live in a world that's going to be more sustainable. I think that there's no question that we are starting to take advantage of these crises. And that doesn't make this an optimistic book, but it makes it a hopeful book. And I think that's important.
How were you able to pinpoint the crises you were going to focus on? Because you wrote this book before Russia had even invaded Ukraine.
Well, when the book has to go to press on February 28th and the Russians invade on February 24th, I think we can say that makes it a little more complicated. There's no question. But it's interesting, you talking to me right now, Finland is joining NATO. And that's because of this crisis. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. The Germans are actually spending finally 2% of their GDP on defense. NATO itself is no longer brain dead, as Macron called it. It actually has an electroshock to it. It's not adrift. It actually has a mission. That's because of this crisis. Biden, in his State of the Union a couple of months ago, the first 10 minutes, if you were squinting, you could be excused for actually believing that the US has a really functional democracy, because the Democrats and Republicans all stood and applauded when he talked about the need to stand up to Putin. I mean, before the invasion, the Democrats and Republicans thought the principal enemy to the United States were their antagonists across the aisle in the United States. Now they all agree it's Putin. That's because of the crisis. So, I mean, the fact is that even though this started right at the end of me drafting the book, it was so easy to write in the book about the role that this crisis was going to play, because we've all known that the transatlantic relationship was feeling more and more broken. We've all known that the United States didn't feel like the global policeman or the cheerleader of global values, the architect of rule of law. And yet, increasingly, that role is desperately required because of what's happening on the ground in Europe, facing an existential threat from a country with 6,000 nuclear weapons. And so, yeah, I think when you see that, when you see the ability of countries when they're forced to, and of citizens when they're forced to make a real difference, you and I know we don't give our best when it's not hard, right? We just deal, we complain, and we sort of rue the inevitability of our lot. But we also know that when it's urgent, and if we're capable, we can show people what we're made of. And that's what the power of crisis is fun. And it's in a target-rich environment for crises globally. And that is what we are in right now. There's not just one or two. I think so many people are talking about how the wheels are falling off. I think that this was a desperate time for a book that says, actually, there's a lot of hay to be made as a consequence of these crises.
Well, let me ask you about NATO, because certainly it has been solidified and strengthened, and it's playing a bigger role than I think heretofore it has. On the other hand, it does seem slightly impotent to the average person who watches day after day death and destruction unfolding in Ukraine. And so, yes and no, right?
I think that anyone that recognizes that Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelensky is still there in Kiev after 3 months of relentless military assault from the Russian military, which is 10 times the spend of the Ukrainian military. And they've seen the world leaders traveling to Kiev to support him. They've seen the extraordinary military support and training and intelligence that's been provided to the Ukrainian president. They've seen the unprecedented sanctions against Russia, 6 rounds of sanctions from Europe. Half of their central bank reserves have been frozen. No one thought that was going to happen. The Europeans are cutting off their energy imports from Russia. Coal already done, oil in process, gas within 3 years. That's a cost directly on European citizens. And they're doing it for another country. So, I mean, with all due respect, Katie, I think what we're seeing right now from the West, from NATO, is so much greater than anyone thought they were capable of anymore, including, by the way, first and foremost, Vladimir Putin. I don't think he would have invaded if he had thought this outcome from the West was remotely possible, because he didn't believe that the West had it in them. And it turned out we needed a crisis.
Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. You study this, Ian, all the time. And I think the big question is, will this be a long, protracted war? What is he thinking? Is he going to escalate? In his Victory Day speech, you say it's notable he made no claim of victory or mission accomplished. Obviously, that would have been false news. But why do you think it's significant that Vladimir Putin took on a more calibrated tone?
Well,
has he been humbled?
No. I don't. I think it would be an overstatement to say that anything that Putin does is humble. But this war is not going the way he wanted it to. And I think he recognizes that. He may not want to admit it publicly, but he recognizes it. I mean, even Belarus, his one buddy in the region, the president came out a week ago and said, yeah, this is taking longer than we thought it was going to. I mean, you just don't see that kind of thing from a dictator like that. Where is it going to go? Well, unfortunately, I think that the peace dividend for Europe is over. For 30 years, there was a belief that they didn't need to prioritize national security. They didn't need to prioritize defense. They didn't need to prioritize even the European Union. And now they recognize, no, these things that we have fought for decades, we cannot take them for granted. We need to prioritize them. That's why Macron won fairly easily once he decided to start actually campaigning against Marine Le Pen, because the French, as much as they don't love Macron, they understand they can't have a Eurosceptic running France, because they need these institutions to fight against the Russian government, the Putin dictatorship. So I think that there is going to be an ongoing, long-standing fight with Ukraine, and that the West is going to have to continue to support this guy for the foreseeable future. I believe that Russia, a G20 economy, has been cut off from the advanced industrial economies of the world, and that's permanent. It's permanent. I don't think we can unfreeze the assets. I don't think we can start doing a business again. I don't think the oligarchs will be able to start traveling again, because I think that the necessary antecedents, the preconditions from Russia that would be required to allow that removal of those sanctions or softening is just inconceivable in any scenario in the near term.
So it's just going to go on and on and on. And you believe, with the help of NATO and the West, that Ukraine can continue to sustain this amount of destruction and brutality, really?
The Ukrainians are paying a horrible cost. Over 5 million Ukrainians in 3 months have been forced from their country, not just their homes, and they're in Europe. But they're living largely in the homes of Europeans who have taken them in, not in refugee camps. That's a big deal. And yes, territory has been destroyed. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians likely dead. The official numbers are in the 3,000, but it's clearly far, far more than that. War crimes have been committed, acts of torture, acts of rape. I mean, it's unimaginable to say that Ukraine's going to get through this just fine. I mean, no one could make that argument given what we have seen and what we haven't yet seen from the last few months. But I believe that the Ukrainian government will stand and will end up stronger as a consequence of having been tested in this crucible of an unjustified military invasion.
Getting back to your book, Ian, you talk about crises, but you say not all are the same. And you describe something as a Goldilocks crisis. What does that mean exactly?
A Goldilocks crisis, it's not too big, it's not too small. It's just right. It's just the right breakfast, it's just the right bed. It is, if a crisis is too small, in some ways, and this, it is so painful for me to say this, but in some ways the pandemic was too small for us to take seriously. It
Come on.
allowed,
That sounds
yeah,
insane.
no, it's insane. It's insane. But the fact is, in relatively short order, we had vaccines. In the early days, a lot of people in the West were like, "Well, this isn't really me. I'm young. I don't have pre-existing conditions. I don't need to mask up. I don't need to worry. This is about other people." And that led to it allowed for a politicization of that crisis between Democrats and Republicans, red states and blue states, also between the US and China. Trump left the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. And if it was a much bigger crisis, I don't think he would have been able to do that, not even Trump. So I do believe that in some ways, the pandemic wasn't big enough to get the Americans to rally together around the flag. It wasn't big enough to force the Americans and Chinese to work together to take it seriously. China has a zero COVID policy right now because they refuse to license Western mRNA vaccines for their own country. They can afford that level of nationalism because the disease, even though it's causing all these problems, these lockdowns, it's not big enough to force them to actually swallow their pride. And so, no, we need to work with the Americans on this. We need to work with the Europeans on this. Where if a crisis is too big, I mean, if you're talking about like World War III is imminent and there's nothing you can do about it, well, you're just going to go into your bomb shelter. In many ways, climate change is a Goldilocks crisis because it's huge, but we're capable. Finally, now that we're all understand what's happening, we admit it, we see it, we accept the science, by the way. Unlike the pandemic where so many people were sowing disinformation, 195 countries get together every year and they say climate change is driven by mankind. And furthermore, 1.2 degrees of warming, we've already seen it. Here's what's going to happen if we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere. Like literally, we all, Democrats, Republicans, Americans, Indians, Chinese, New Zealand, doesn't matter. We all agree what the problem is and what needs to be done. We may not want to take the same solutions. We may not want to pay for it, but just being willing to identify a common problem is absolutely indispensable to be able to start to respond to it. And so in many ways, climate change, which has been described as this existential crisis for humanity and for all species on the planet, turns out to have many of the aspects of a Goldilocks crisis. And that's a very hopeful thing.
Before we talk about climate change and how the world is actually responding after years of climate change deniers, I think, obstructing any progress, do you think the pandemic would have been a Goldilocks crisis if there had been less political polarization in the country? I can't believe that it's not universally or even globally considered a massive crisis, given the impact on the economy, given the millions upon millions of people who died worldwide. If, I think about polio, or I think about other health crises that have affected the country and the world. And it's hard for me to understand why this wasn't a Goldilocks crisis, given all the holes in the system this laid bare.
Well, actually, I think you're right. And I think the reason you can show you're right is because the Europeans responded to the same crisis, the same pandemic, and they learned some very big lessons. Europe got stronger because of the COVID crisis, and the United States got weaker and more divided. In the case of Europe, they had the advantage of having come through this existential crisis of Grexit after the global financial crisis, when it looked like the EU itself might potentially fall apart. And then they had the Brits leave, of course, and everyone saw what a dog's breakfast that was. And then COVID hits, and the wealthy countries in Europe immediately say unprecedented levels of support from those countries to the poorer countries. The same countries that they said back in 2008, 2009, 2010, no, you're lazy, you don't pay taxes, we're not going to help you, we're going to kick you out of the EU unless you accept the depression. When COVID hit, the Dutch and the Germans and the Danes, they actually opened their wallets and they sent that money to the Greeks and the Italians and the Southern Europeans and the East Europeans, who now are much more committed to the European Union. As a consequence of that, they feel a greater level of solidarity. And also, the Americans, Trump's Operation Warp Speed, we paid a lot more for vaccines, but we got access to those vaccines very quickly. Europe is bureaucratic. It took them longer. But the Europeans, they didn't have any authority over procurement of vaccines. They decided that they needed to. So they built that at a Brussels all-European level, and they together procured vaccines for all of Europe. And they ensured that whether you were poor or rich in Europe, you had access, no matter what the country was. That's a really big deal. So the Europeans took the same crisis, and it was a Goldilocks crisis to a much greater degree for them. Europe comes out of this politically stronger and economically more integrated than they came into the crisis. And you know, in the United States, there's no question that the level of division and political dysfunction, as well as the level of wealth in the United States, which makes us shrug our shoulders more when these things happen, I think makes the bar for how big the crisis needs to be before we can be bothered with it a little bit higher.
Let's return to climate change. How do you think the response to this global threat, existential threat, as you describe, is giving you hope? What is actually happening in the world that makes you believe that this crisis has presented an opportunity? Because for so long, it hasn't. And there are UN report after UN report that basically say the window has all but closed to changing the course and the impact of climate change. So give us something to be optimistic about, Ian.
Well, first, Katie, we want the United Nations and those focused on climate to continue to say that, because we don't want humanity to suddenly get lazy and say, oh, okay, well, we've done what we needed to do. We don't need to worry as much about climate anymore. You need that urgency, right? I mean, they're trying to say every year, they're trying with their statements to say this is a Goldilocks crisis. It's really big. It's a real disaster, but we can still do it. It's right. They're trying to make that keep the urgency, but not create despondency, not create hopelessness. But if I'm not the Secretary General of the UN, I'm just Ian Bremmer talking to you, Katie, and I'm just trying to explain the world to people. Fact is that you've seen a sea change. Young people around the world, under 40, no matter what their political background, especially in wealthy countries, are increasingly saying, you energy companies, you bankers, you corporations that I buy my sneakers from, you government leaders, you are ruining the future of the world, my world that I'm going to grow up in, because you have ignored this issue, and I'm going to make you pay. I will not buy from you. I will not support your company. I will not invest in your bank unless you make a change. And so that was one big shift. And then we saw the bankers who have a longer term horizon, not like hedge funds, who have these massive pension investments into their portfolios that have a 10-year horizon. And they basically say, well, given where the world is going and given where people are going, we're not going to make any money if we invest in thermal coal. We're not going to make any money if we have long-term exposure in fossil fuels. That's not the future. And so then you started to see Larry Fink from BlackRock and then Citigroup and others saying, we just can't invest. And
having said that, I just read that Larry Fink has announced they're going to do less social, corporate social responsibility investing. Did you read that, Ian?
Yeah, I have, but I will tell you that this is already, the train has left the station. This is trillions of dollars that is looking to make a return. They're not doing this because their social consciousness is high. They're doing it because they believe that the best way they can make money long-term is to invest in where the planet is going to be in 10 years. And in 10 years, it's not going to be primarily in fossil fuels. By 2045, a majority of the world's energy is likely to come from non-fossil fuels, from renewables, from nuclear. And that's a big deal. That means that, look, we are still on a pathway for 2.5 centigrade degrees of warming. And that is a horrible place to be. But just 5 years ago, you had global climate experts that were saying it could be 4 degrees, could be 5, it could be 6. That the planet could not be hospitable for billions of people by 2100. No one credible is saying that anymore, because we've invested so much money into solar and electric vehicles and batteries and the supply chains for that at scale that we now know that those technologies will work. They will become the next global dominant players for energy. And that's going to change our carbon footprint. Now, have we done enough? No, but we now can be hopeful. We haven't fixed the problem, but it's a Goldilocks crisis. And what's interesting is it's a Goldilocks crisis despite the fact that the US government at the federal level and the Chinese government at the national level haven't done much leading. It's being done outside of those two most powerful actors in the world. It's being done at the state government level. It's being done by mayors. It's being done by CEOs. It's being done by civic leaders. It's being done by the Gates Foundation. It's being done by the Europeans. It's
by
not
Michael
by Beijing
Bloomberg.
and Washington.
Michael Bloomberg.
Michael Bloomberg, absolutely. And I mean, when the United States under Trump left the Paris Climate Accord, everyone said it was a disaster. And yet you had Michael Bloomberg and all of these CEOs and mayors and governors say, we are going to continue to abide by those commitments, even if it's no longer the law of the land. And they did.
That's well and good, Ian, but without China's cooperation or any action by China, the world's biggest polluter, how can we really get a handle on climate change?
So by far, the largest investor in solar cell technology in the world is China, by far. I would be so much more pessimistic about the ability to move to renewables as a sustainable energy form at scale if it wasn't for how far and how fast the Chinese invested in that. Electric vehicles and rare earth metals and the necessity of those supply chains. The Chinese have been dominant in that. Tesla, their biggest market, where is it? It's of course in China, right? So look, what I'm saying is that the Chinese are not leading with the rest of the world. They're not sitting with the United States and say, let's be collective about this. But they absolutely, like Larry Fink, they see the writing on the wall. And so what's happening is that you're going to have a new competitive, almost a war footing. Because now, it used to be when you talked about climate in the United States, you talked largely about progressives, the Sierra Club, Save the Whales, Hug the Trees.
Tree huggers, yeah.
Yeah. And now what you're doing is you're having, anywhere in Washington, you talk to a political leader, they understand the Chinese are leading the world in the move to renewables. And the Americans, we need to take that seriously. We need to dominate that. We can't let the Chinese dominate on electric vehicles. We have to do that. We can't let them dominate in solar and wind. We have to do that. Governor Abbott down in Texas, we have to do that. It's not just Mike Bloomberg. It's not just the left. It's the right too. They want to ensure that the Americans are strategically dominant in post-carbon energy production. And that is, not all competitions are vicious. Sometimes they're virtuous. So what I'm saying, Katie, is not that I love and trust the Chinese government. What I'm saying is that despite the fact that we're not getting cooperative leadership, we are actually starting to break the back of this problem. And I think that is an incredibly important baseline, because without that, we're nowhere.
I want to ask you about food insecurity. Like the invasion of Ukraine, well, really a result of the invasion of Ukraine, food insecurity is going to be a massive global crisis affecting the poorest countries in the world. And it's interesting how you link things like food insecurity to geopolitics, because that feeds, so to speak, the rise of populism and other, forms of, I guess, behavior that is incredibly destabilizing. So how can food insecurity, if it's not already, be turned into a Goldilocks crisis?
Well, I would say, first of all, it is harder to make food insecurity a Goldilocks crisis, precisely because it affects the poorest, the most disenfranchised people in the world. In that regard, it's like climate change was 20, 30 years ago, when the prime minister of the Maldives is having a summit underwater with scuba gear to say, hey, everybody pay attention, and everyone's saying, not going to happen to us. But then when you start to see the wildfires in California and Australia, you say, oh, wait a second, maybe we need to pay attention to this, right? So it is a lot harder to motivate and mobilize the effective resources for Bangladesh and Lebanon and Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen than it is to avert World War III with the Russians in Europe, or to deal with climate change now that everyone in the world is seeing the impact. It's a real problem. And we are seeing already that, a lot of these poorest countries that have been very stressed, they have higher indebted levels now that are unsustainable because they needed to spend a lot more money during 2 years of pandemic. And now they're dealing with unprecedented inflation at the same time that they don't have access to the same levels of credit. Well, what are you going to do? How do you feed your people? Russia is the largest grain producer in the world. Ukraine is the 5th largest. They're both critical for fertilizer export. And you've just massively disrupted those things. Number one, because of the war. And so, literally, a lot of farmers in Ukraine just can't actually plant their crops. And furthermore, the infrastructure around seed and fertilizer has been destroyed and disrupted. And then the largest port in Ukraine, Odessa, is, they can't get anything out because of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. And Russia has all these sanctions against it that's making it much tougher for them. Even things like agricultural componentry, which are breaking down because they can't get the parts, right?
And this is after an already interrupted supply chain, right?
Yes. So, what's going to happen? Food prices go up, and the people that can't afford it won't have access. And, in 6 and 12 months' time, you're going to see that it's going to be a lot easier for pigs in Europe to get access to food so that people that are willing to pay the money can have their bacon, as opposed to some of the poorest people in the world who don't have access, who can't pay those market prices. That's going to be that competition for basic foodstuffs is absolutely brutal. And for the last 50 years, the world has dramatically reduced extreme poverty through globalization, through openness of international trade, through global efficiency of markets. That has turned around dramatically in the last 2 years of the pandemic, and it's now been accelerated because of the war of Russia into Ukraine.
And talk about the impact that has on geopolitics writ large.
Well, one impact is more migration. One impact is when people are starving, where the food is not, they will do everything they can to move to where the food is. That, again, tends to be neighboring countries who are doing a little bit better, but aren't usually very rich. So Jordan has to deal with it. Turkey has to deal with it. Uganda has to deal with it, but not as many get to come to the United States. So the reason that I didn't talk much, food insecurity is a huge problem, and I mention it in the book, but it's not one of my core global crises because it's not global. it affects a relatively significant swath of the global population that happens to be very poor and that just doesn't move the needle for the rest of us. Now, that's an important book. It's a different book.
But what about authoritarian regimes and how this affects sort of the direction countries go in when there are these kinds of humanitarian crises?
Well, I mean, clearly, when you have that level of political instability at home, they want to throw the bums out. And frequently, the people that take advantage of that can be strongman dictators. This is how you get the rise of a Viktor Orban in Hungary, of a Recep Erdogan in Turkey, of a Nicolas Maduro after Chavez in Venezuela. And we are seeing that global populations today, a larger percentage, live in states that are either unfree or only partly free, and the move towards democracy has been significantly constrained. And Freedom House every year does a wonderful index rating all of the countries in the world. And you can see this every year over the last 20 years. This trajectory is not where we want it to be. Some of it is because of economic inequality of opportunity, creating political backlash. Some of it is identity politics, backlash with immigration, racial politics in the United States, that kind of thing. Some of it is technology. And the fact that we used to have a communications revolution that empowered individuals. Now we have a surveillance revolution, which is more top-down, empowers authoritarian states. It's more illiberal. And then finally, some of it is driven by this extraordinary shift in the lack of well-being of the poorest in the world because of the pandemic and because of the Russia invasion. And that is, it's adding fuel to the fire, clearly.
Let's finish by talking about AI, because I know that you talk about the speed of technological change and describe it as the biggest risk of all, or the impending crisis that we're all likely to face. Can you dumb it down for me, Ian? How is AI such a huge threat, and what can be done about it?
It's the most existential. It's also the one that is not quite yet here in front of us in the way that the pandemic and climate and Russia really are. And I write about it because it's coming real soon to a theater near you. We know it's coming. And what do I mean by that? I mean, because these are incredibly disruptive technologies and you cannot prevent their proliferation. So I'm talking about cyber, for example, and the fact that it's not just about the United States and Russia, but it's also about terrorist organizations and rogue states that have access increasingly to these capabilities that can bring down a global economy and that can lead to massive global disruption as a consequence. I'm talking about lethal autonomous weapons. I remember when that drone took a photo of Angela Merkel, and it was only about 12 feet away from her. It was just this random hobbyist who had access to the drone. Well, if it had a rifle on it, she'd be dead. And increasingly, those weapons can be produced easily at scale and can be in the hands not just of big conventional armies, but of small numbers of individuals that don't represent any state, that have the ability to massively disrupt the way humanity works. And then when you talk about artificial intelligence, which have the ability to change the very way we think as human beings, not just nature and nurture, but how we consider the world, our community, who we like, who we hate, how angry we are, how optimistic we are, and who controls those algorithms. Are they even tested on anyone before they're thrown out there for our children to be affected by? And the answer is no. So all of those things which are expanding explosively, breakneck speed, and yet governments don't really regulate them, they don't really understand them, and increasingly a small number of technology companies actually exercise sovereignty in the digital space. So literally, if Elon Musk buys Twitter, that will have more impact on the 2024 election in some ways than almost anything that Biden could or could not do. Well, I mean, one person shouldn't have that kind of authority, and yet he will decide whether or not he's going to put Trump back on Twitter. I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad idea. I'm simply saying that the fact that that decision is in the hands of one guy is something new, and is something that we need to recognize that has as a global crisis we will need to respond to.
So is it a Goldilocks crisis or not? Or
We don't know.
is it permeating, society? It's such a kind of weirdly quick pace, but yet at a pace that I don't think people understand it. It feels also incremental. At the same time, it feels fast. What will be done about it? And is the genie out? Is the proverbial genie out of the bottle?
Look, I mean, the genie is out of the bottle in the sense that it cannot be stopped. It cannot be contained. It's not like nuclear weapons and proliferation, where they were very expensive. They were very complex. You require very dangerous materials that there's only a limited amount. It was fairly easy to create controls that would stop nuclear weapons from proliferating significantly. And that's been true over, the majority of a century. That's pretty extraordinary in terms of technological proliferation, right? When the things we're talking about right now, that you don't have that kind of fix where you can say, okay, let's have a proliferation regime. Let's just stop it from happening. So it's going to have to be much more about management. It's going to be much more about constraint, about nudging, about shifting, about understanding. And look, the negative side of this, and I wrote about this a little bit at the beginning of the book. I'm someone who's always believed that there's clearly other intelligent life out there. The universe is so vast. There are so many planets in the Goldilocks zone, which is where I thought about the Goldilocks crisis. Not too warm, not too cold, that could create life. Clearly, there's other intelligent life. The only question is there intelligent life now? Because the amount of time between when humanity has the ability to shape its environment and when humanity has the ability to completely destroy itself is a cosmological eye blink. It's a snap of a finger. And so, I mean, there is an open question that if AI is not a Goldilocks crisis, we're not going to be here in 50 years. And if that's the way it goes, whenever you develop too much technology as an intelligent species, then that means that around the universe, there's been all sorts of intelligent species that pops up and then goes away. And that's why we don't find anything out there, is because it's not there right now. But I don't want that to be the solution.
I was going to say, Ian, I thought this was a hopeful book.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think that you can't just put your hands up and say there's nothing we can do. I think at the very least, I'm telling you honestly, Katie, I don't know if AI is a fruitless endeavor to try to respond against, or if it's a Goldilocks crisis. But if you don't know, how can you not try? I'm not going to lie and say, I know that climate change is a Goldilocks crisis. I know that. And that's an extraordinary thing to say. I know that the Russia invasion of Ukraine is a Goldilocks crisis. That's an extraordinary thing to say. I'm not sure about AI. It may not be, but we should operate under the assumption that it is and try our damnedest to respond accordingly. That's the honest thing to say.
I guess I always wonder about that holy shit Martha moment. And if enough people are saying that, or they're complacent as they were for so long when it came to climate change.
Look, why do I want to write this book? My hope is that I can get more people to move more quickly to the holy shit moment on AI. And, the fact is that it took us too long on climate, but we finally got there. And if I had the presence that I have now and had been writing about climate 30, 40 years ago, maybe it would have moved the needle faster. So, I mean, if you do what I do, how can you not write this book right now?